Okay, welcome back everybody. Want to say everybody's doing still pretty good on the on your discussion questions, and going to be getting those exams to you in the next day or two. So everybody keep up the good work, and we'll continue on with the semester. Okay, so we are now getting into the major parts of macroeconomics. We talked about gross domestic product and unemployment. Last time, again, gross domestic product, it is the total output of final new goods and services produced domestically in 1 year. And that is the output, the method, that's the one that normally comes to mind. But again, real fast, there are three ways to calculate our gross domestic product, which you're going to need to remember for the next exam. Output, total output, and then there's total expenditure, which is all segments of the economy, consumers, business investment, government, and exports minus imports, or what they call net exports. So total expenditures, and then total factor income. We are the factors of production, so total income coming into all households, all right? And what's interesting, again, about these, that no matter which method you choose, you'll arrive at the same, you should, if you do it correctly, you'll arrive at the same number for gross domestic product. Okay, so that's recapping GDP. Then we talked about unemployment, and remember, we in our discussions have been talking about four kinds of unemployment. The fourth one is not in your book, but we do bring it up, seasonal unemployment. Again, quickly, the first one, frictional, that's just the when people change jobs or move, and typically they are looking for work, but they just quite haven't found the exact perfect job for them, or the company hasn't found them. Typically, it's not as long-term as some unemployments. And again, remember, we always have friction. We always have that time frame where people are moving or changing jobs, and we'll always see that even in a healthy economy. We have frictional. People just haven't found that perfect job. Maybe there's 2 or 3 companies looking at them, and they're going to be working for one of them, but they just haven't, the gears haven't meshed yet. But typically, that's on the shorter term. The structural one, which is the second one we talked about quickly, something in the economy has structurally changed. So we call it structural unemployment. An evolving economy, as we talked about, it's always changing. Unfortunately, for some jobs, some industries are dying, but then new industries are being created. Hopefully, it's not too long if you are experiencing one of those kinds of unemployment and your industry is dying. Hopefully it's not doesn't involve too much for you to be retrained into an emerging industry, and quite honestly, hopefully you can find a job in the new industries that were somewhat equal to your old job in terms of, well, it's just in terms of benefits and wages and so on and so forth. Again, structural unemployment and frictional are always with a healthy economy. So when we talk about we are at full employment, when economists say we're at full employment, that doesn't mean everybody's working. That still means we're still going to have frictional and structural unemployment, okay? And we add the two together, frictional and structural, and it gives us the natural rate. Depending on which textbook you look at, you could be around 5%. So even in a healthy economy, typically we're still going to have folks moving or changing jobs, or their industry has been, consolidating, getting smaller, and they're laying off. and other industries are growing, so they're looking to move into another type of industry. So we always have that, and typically in a healthy economy, you're always going to have about 5% unemployment. Okay. The next one is the biggie. That's the scary one, cyclical. That means we are in the recession part of the business cycle. It's over and above the natural rate of unemployment. So if the natural rate of unemployment is 5%, that's frictional and structural, and we are in a recession, maybe the unemployment rate goes up another 2 points or 3, maybe up all the way up to 8%. That's a little scarier than the first two because of the unknown factor. We don't know how long this recession is going to last, and when folks are going to be called back to work. So that's the most severe type of unemployment. Okay, then the fourth one is seasonal. Normally that's probably the least worrisome. It's something the economy expects, happens every year. The economy expects it to happen, society expects it to happen, and it prepares for it. And when it does happen, it's not that big of a deal because it happens, every year. So that is the least worrisome. All right, and those are the four types of unemployment. Again, being employed, you're working. However, it could mean that you're working just part-time and you're still counted as employed, which is difficult. And again, today's society, a lot of businesses are just offering folks 28 hours, 29 hours of work, and they want full-time. Those folks are still counted as employed. Or perhaps you have a job that you're working at, and again, as I said, there's dignity in all work. But if you have a PhD in, let's say, in something, and you're mopping a floor in a fast food restaurant, and again, there's nothing wrong with that. There's dignity in all work, but you would be considered overqualified, but you're still considered employed. All right. Unemployed means you are not actively working, but you are actively looking for a job. So if you give up or get discouraged and say, oh, I'm going to take a month off from looking for work, then statistically you're not counted as unemployed. All right, so if we add the unemployed and the employed together, we end up with the labor force, okay? And these can be further looked at. We have the unemployed over the labor force times 100 gives us the unemployment rate. And we talk about the labor force participation rate. It seems as though we talk about that, or you hear about that a lot more than we ever used to. When I was in college, we didn't talk about the labor force participation rate much. It was more the the unemployment rate. But again, the labor force participation rate is we take the unemployed and the employed, and we divide it by the total population of 16 years of age and up. Okay, and what you would ideally like is to see that number, increasing. You hate to see that getting smaller because that means your population is growing, but the folks that are either employed or even unemployed as a percentage of your total population is getting smaller. Okay, so that's recapping where we've been. Now we're going to talk about the second great evil of macroeconomics, which is inflation. Okay, and for our intents and purposes, we're going to refer to inflation as it is the general rise in the price level. Right, and we measure it. Typically, one of the tools that we use to measure it is the CPI, Consumer Price Index. Okay, and by the way, what's deflation? Well, deflation, and we'll look at it a little bit further in just a few minutes. Deflation is the general lowering of the price level, and that can be worrisome for a government as much as inflation. We'll talk about that again in just a few minutes. Okay, getting back to CPI, it is the cost of living. It measures what they do is they take a typical, they call it a typical family of four living in a medium-sized city. Basically, what do they buy in a year? What do they spend their money on? And they have a market, what they call a market basket of goods and services that a typical family of four living in a medium-sized city, would buy. And then they look at this market basket and they compare, they try to keep it the same from year to year to year. And they'll just look at what the price has, how the prices have changed from that market basket of identical goods, or as close to identical as possible, from one year to the next. Okay? Okay, so in our book, they have the breakdown of the our consumer price index. They have two breakdowns. One actually how they look at it, and one how you and I are actually spending our money. So the two breakdowns are a little different. We'll just use the one that they had in the pie chart. I think is a pretty good one. So what is it comprised of? Well, we've got housing number one, which probably stands to reason, and that's the big one, 42%. And the other one, it says it's about a third. Transportation, now that's interesting because it's different in the other one. The one that we, in the pie chart, has about 17% of our expenditures on transportation. Now, again, and a lot of these graphs or charts, whatever, it depends on how you break it down. Transportation, if it's just the price of the car, that's one thing, but if you have the price of the car, insurance, maintenance, and then include gasoline, and we all know what gasoline has done in the last little bit, unfortunately, I think 17% is about accurate. Food, about 14%, I think that's about right, except in my case, when I had my 9 children at home, I think it was quite a bit higher than 14%. Medical care, now this could change also. Now, most of you are very young, you got the vast majority of your life ahead of you. Your medical costs probably in general are on the lower side, might be a little less than this. As you get older and more mature, your spending on medical items or medical care could even be higher than that. And then we have just breakdown, recreation, communication, so on and so forth. Okay, so we use the consumer price index to see, how are these prices changing, from one year to the next. Now your grandparents are really happy probably with the consumer price index because of what happened last month in January. They got the largest increase in quite a few years in Social Security. Okay, so they're probably not unhappy. They're probably happy with the fact that the consumer price index adjusted their Social Security. I believe the average is around $80 some per month, which is a pretty good increase there, because the last couple of 2 or 3 years it's been just about nothing, or very, very, very small increases, $20 some a month. So they're probably happy with that. Okay. Again, we look at the how the prices have changed. Typically, when we talk about a base year, we go back and typically we'll have that as 100, and moving forward, we'll say, okay, what has it done 10 years or 15 years into the future? And it's just if the market basket and the base year was 100 and now it's 120, you can say, well, okay, in the last however many years it is, the inflation factor is about 20%. All right, so we use it to see how how items have changed, how some things, are they good deals, or are they just so-so, or maybe not quite as good as they used things as they used to be. And from our book, it shows you a fountain drink, 1942 Coke was about a nickel. Adjusted for inflation back to 42, it should be 79 cents, but typically now it's around 63. So that's a pretty good deal, okay? A Hershey's chocolate. Now, Hershey's chocolate bar, not quite a good deal because of the drought that they had in terms of the cocoa crop, okay? So supply has been cut back, but we will talk about chocolate in just a few minutes when we start talking about the causes of inflation. But the Hershey's candy bar, not quite as good a deal as it used to be. McDonald's hamburger. Now, in 1955, 15 cents for McDonald's hamburger. And I remember back, there was a McDonald's on Van Dyke near the GM Tech Center. This is going back a long time ago. And the prices were, very good. However, now again, McDonald's had that dollar menu, and I was talking to a lot of students, and they were saying, well, it's not so much that they have that dollar menu anymore, but they do advertise, well, if you buy something, you can have these other items for $1. So since it was still in your textbook, we'll typically refer to that dollar item. So if a McDonald's hamburger was 15 cents, adjusted for inflation, it should be $1.40 now. And going on the idea of the $1 menu, at $1, it's a good deal now. All right. Also, Oreo cookies. They have been priced well since the 1922. Okay. Now the last 40 or 50 years, when we look at what happens in pricing, we see that the average has been about 4%, maybe 3.5% to 4% on average. Now we're not including we are including the inflationary years of the late 70s and the 80s. Though that's when inflation was really ticking up, and it's very difficult for an economy to operate when inflation is really taking off like that. We haven't had it as bad as many countries, but it is very difficult, and we'll be talking about that and looking at countries like Germany in 1920s, and Zimbabwe, Venezuela. It is very difficult. Now, aside from I know we have been experiencing. Right now, we're looking at around 7% inflation rate because of COVID. And again, doesn't matter what administration we have. When you have that much spending, and you haven't brought up your productivity to the same level, you're going to have inflation. And we had to spend a certain amount of extra money to keep the economy up, and we've done. So I said, it doesn't matter whether it's Democrat or Republican, this is just a fact of life that with COVID, you're going to see a lot more government spending, and you can't help but experiencing a higher rate of inflation. So we're around 7. In the last few years, most of my classes, when I talk about inflation, the students are saying, well, inflation, what's that? Because inflation has been, so low for so many years. But now we finally see it kicking up a bit. Still, though, not as bad as the early 1980s. Okay? All right. Now again, in 1980, we had about 15% inflation, and we had a prime interest rate, which is the interest rate that is charged to the bank's best customers, at about 21%. Now, what this does, still, when we look at some hyperinflationary times for countries like Germany in the 1920s or Zimbabwe in 2008, this still isn't quite that bad, but it's still very disruptive to an economy. When we were hitting 15% inflation and 21% prime rate, the problem is that, you know, why would a business invest in new expensive equipment when you can get 13 and 14% on your money without any risk? Why would you? And this absolutely happened. We saw it when we had our manufacturing plants. You're looking at an expensive piece of equipment, maybe $500,000 or $700,000, and if you have a certain amount of money set aside to buy it, but you're thinking you're going to finance the rest of it or a good portion of it, why would you go out and borrow money at 21 or 22 or 23% and on a piece of equipment, and you're worried about, then you're worried about, is it going to be, are the people you've got working for you, is it going to be run correctly? You're going to get the production that you thought you were going to get, and then you finally, ship the parts out to GM, Ford, or Chrysler, wherever it's going, and then you have to wait to get paid. And back in those days, we weren't getting paid in 30 days, so then you're going to wait for your money. And then when it's all said and done, you have to think, was this priced out correctly? Even if everything went perfectly, you have to think about, did I price out this contract at the right price? So you've got all these worries, and that's exactly what happened to a lot of businesses. They definitely thought twice before investing in new capital equipment, and that's one of the problems that an economy faces. And it took us a while to get out of that recession, which was caused, again, we'll talk about it in a minute, by the double hit we saw in the 1970s in terms of oil, all right? But we'll talk about those causes of inflation and what happened in the resultant recession in 1980. But that was a tough time. In fact, we had a little bit of both. They call it stagflation. We had high unemployment and inflation, so it was the worst of both worlds. We had that supply curve shifting to the left, and what that did, prices went up and transactions went down. So we were in a recession and we had high unemployment. Okay, so that's our first board, and we've got a few boards for today. Get to the next one. All right. So as we were saying, we try to keep that market basket of goods and services, the CPI, we try to keep it the same. Quickly, the problems with the CPI, we're going to need to remember some of these, all of these actually. Goods can be substituted. We don't necessarily have to absolutely buy an item that's in that market basket that went up substantially. So we can avoid sometimes the big price increase. So occasionally we'll say that, oh, okay, well, the CPI might be overstating inflation because of the fact that we can substitute. It's not all the time, but sometimes it is possible, okay? The second problem is that the quality of goods is better now. And we're going to talk about that a lot more when we talk about growth theory. And that's true. I mean, look at your television sets. What they've done, in the last 20 or 30 years, how much better they are. Okay, so the quality is better. Cars also. And again, we'll talk about that as some of the benefits in growth theory that'll be coming up. Okay, so quality of goods is typically higher now. And then, excuse me, we do have some goods and services that we didn't have before, such as iPads and Alexa, which my daughters keep buying for me, and I keep giving it back because I don't want one in my house. But aside from that, there are a lot of new goods and services that we didn't have before. So again, absolutely comparing the same market basket year after year, it is sometimes difficult. Okay? One thing we don't have in our book, but you're going to need to remember, is in addition to the Consumer Price Index, we have the Producer Price Index, okay? Now, Consumer Price Index is what you and I typically buy, okay? Things that we buy, the average family of four would buy. The Producer Price Index is another index which is important because it's centered more on, well, on the producers, all right? It's also called the Wholesale Price Index. Now, this one is a market basket of raw materials or commodities, steel, coal, electricity. All right, now you think, okay, well, why is that important? Well, it's important because just think, before you go to buy, let's say you go to buy a toaster, and you go and you look at it and say, oh, wow, that toaster is 10% more than I remember it being. Well, before that toaster went up in price, all the components of that toaster had to go up in price, you know? So we had the springs, we had the rubber, we had the plastic, maybe the real thin sheet metal, or all those component items, you know, had to go up first. And typically, that would have happened perhaps 4, 5, 6 months prior to the actual price of the toaster going up. So what the raw materials, how the raw materials are moving price-wise is important, because it gives us an early warning sign of what's going to happen price-wise in consumer goods. Because all those components went up first and then finally hit the market when we paid 10% more for the toaster, okay? So that's the Producer Price Index. It's an early warning sign to either inflation, typically inflation, and that's why it's important, but it's not in our book, so make sure you remember that. You more than likely this will be included as part of a question. Okay, real fast, cost of inflation. In general, the greatest cost of inflation is the loss of purchasing power of our money, okay? Now, in our book, quickly, we have what they call shoe leather cost. Okay, what is that? Well, it was referring to the cost that involved when people want to get out of money, because money is losing its purchasing power. So you're doing everything you can to, you know, get rid of money and find another asset that's going to hold its value. All right. You talk about folks getting paid, and sometimes in countries that are experiencing hyperinflation, they're getting paid twice a day. You know, they can't, because of the fact they can't wait till Friday, because they need to get their money and they're trying to get out of money. They're trying to buy anything, something that's going to hold its value. All that effort, time, energy, and, you know, wasted resources running around trying to get out of money is a problem, and it's a cost. And what they lump that together as a shoe leather cost. Okay? Money illusion, again, we've got to remember, you know, if you're getting we've got to pull the inflation factor out of whether it's gross domestic product or nominal wages, and pull the inflation factor out of that to get, real wages or interest. We need to bear it in mind what is happening with inflation. If we get a 5% increase in wages, but the inflation factor is 7 or 8%, well, the illusion is that we're doing better, but we're not really doing better because of the inflation factor. So that is a problem. We have to pull the inflation factor out of everything that we possibly can. Menu costs, oh well, again, it's not as problematic as it used to be. Electronics have helped. For instance, gas stations in the old days, you used to have, folks go up there to the sign and physically go change the pricing on the sign, or menus in restaurants would have to change their pricing. That they would just lump all that cost together as menu costs. Okay, future price uncertainty. I mean, well, again, if you are living during times of high inflation, if you're a business owner, do you go in for a long-term contract with your customers? Do you even want to without a reopener clause? I mean, you don't know. There's this amount of uncertainty. Oops, sorry. I should have turned that off. Okay, so there's uncertainty if you're a business owner, or if you're just a wage earner. How much do you ask for in terms of a wage increase? Unions would have that problem. All right, they want to have their membership not lose any ground. So how much do you ask for? Now they used to, in times of high inflation, they would have what is called the cost of living adjustments, and those helped. But it still, the fact remains that if you're just earning a wage or a salary, and you're living in times of high inflation, how much do you ask for to stay at least keep abreast of what the prices are doing? All right, so that can be a problem. Wealth redistribution. Okay, we're going to talk about that in a minute with the winners and losers. When they talk about wealth redistribution, typically they're talking about folks. Let's say if you're borrowing, you borrowed, let's say $10,000 from a bank, and it's a 5-year note. Well, if inflation starts to really move up, let's say you were borrowing the money at 6% interest. Well, if inflation starts going up 7, 8, or 9%, what's happening is you are paying the bank back with what they call cheaper dollars. So if you borrowed money in times of inflation, where inflation is really becoming a factor, you are actually a winner, because you're paying the money back that you borrowed with cheaper dollars. But you got the money, at first blush, you got the money, so you have use of the money. But then as you're repaying the bank, the money is losing its purchasing power. So actually the borrowers are the winners. The folks who lent you the money, the banks, they would be the losers with a higher inflation. Okay, so that would be called a wealth redistribution. Price confusion. All right, well, let's think. If you're making a product, now, if the price is going up, is that because folks really like your product and the demand is way up for your product, or is it just a factor of inflation? So there's a big difference there, because are you going to be looking at this and saying, okay, if it's true that the demand is way up for my product, then you're not going to be afraid to invest more in terms of capital equipment or different expansions on your business. But if it's just a matter of inflation, then there's no reason for you to be looking to invest in expensive capital equipment or expanding your operation, because it's not really that the demand is up, it's just that the prices are up. Okay, so that would be price confusion. Tax distortion, the last one, that has to do with, if you, let's say you bought a piece of property for $100,000, okay, and a year from now, it's during times of high inflation, and a year from now, let's say you want to sell it, and you're going to sell it, and gee whiz, you can get $120,000 for it. So, did you make $20,000 on the property or not? Well, if inflation was really, moving up, and let's say that was all inflationary, the $20,000 that you thought you made on the property, you didn't really make anything. All right, you sold it basically for what you paid for the land. However, this is the problem. If you sold it for $120,000, and that $20,000 is strictly the inflation factor, you or we still have to pay tax on the gains from the sale. All right, even though in reality we didn't gain anything, we just basically broke even. So we're paying a tax on the inflation, and that's how they got the name inflation tax. Okay, so and it's basically an inflation tax, because we're paying tax on a gain, but it's not really a gain. In other words, the equity value of the property didn't go up by $20,000. The property stayed the same, only the price went up. Okay, so that's what would definitely be called a tax distortion. All right. Okay, so these are going to be important to remember, as well as producer price index and problems with the CPI. Okay, so with that, we'll move on to our next. Let's see how we're doing. I don't want to keep these videos too long, because then they take forever to load. So, all right, we'll move on to the next board. Okay, so we're talking about the winners and the losers with inflation. Well, we did just talk about the borrowers and the lenders. Typically, with during inflationary times, the folks who are lending money would be the losers. Okay, because the folks who are borrowing money are paying the money back with cheaper dollars. The dollars are not worth as much. Okay, and again, that's the basic problem with inflation. It's the loss of purchasing power of your money. Okay, who else wins and who else loses? Well, people who or companies who are what they say first in line to get a wage or a price adjustment. So for instance, if the inflation was running at, let's say it was running at close to 20% a year, but you got an adjustment early in the year, let's say in January, your wages or your prices were adjusted. All right, well, typically, you would be a winner because you got that adjustment early in the year. However, if you had to wait till end of November or December to get that price or your wage finally adjusted, you would be one of the losers, because you experienced the inflation for almost the entire year before you finally had your wages or prices adjusted. Who else would be a loser? Well, bond holders typically, and we're going to be talking about bonds and stocks uh, when we start talking about the loanable funds market. But you know, if you're a bondholder or if you're on fixed income, typically an older couple, perhaps again, Social Security was adjusted a bit in January, but let's say you had a set pension, you got just so much every month. Well, if you're on a fixed income, you know, it stands to reason, you know, if inflation's going up by close to 20%, you know, you're going to be hurting. So you know, you would be one of the losers. Okay, winners again, companies or firms that have inflation adjusted clauses, reopener clauses. Okay, if you had a long-term contract with GM or Ford or Chrysler, you know, do you have a reopener clause in it? You know, if you don't, if you know, you accepted a long-term contract and it locked you in price-wise, you definitely would be considered one of the losers. Okay, going back many years, I knew of a company who did that. They locked in with I believe it was Chrysler with a long-term contract and with no reopener, and actually the company ended up going bankrupt. So companies that don't have a reopener clause in times of high inflation would be the big losers. Okay, and then we talk about, well, you know, business ethics as opposed to personal ethics, and I just bring that up. You know, if you were the head of a public company and you were trying to get a price increase, you know, is there a difference between a personal ethics or business ethics? For instance, if you had a defense contract and you're working for a publicly held company, you have a fiduciary duty to try to maximize the value of everyone's stock, that, you know, whoever owns stock in your company. And you also maybe you have some older couples who depend on the dividends from your stock. So you got all these people depending on you. So you go into the Defense Department. How much do you ask for? You ask for much more than you actually need. You know, there's a whole number of questions that on some economic exams where, well, they'll talk about, you know, business ethics as opposed to personal ethics. Okay? All right. So anyway, now we'll move on to deflation. Now, deflation, that is the general lowering of the price level. And, you know, at first blush, you might think, well, that's not such a bad thing. You know, it'd be kind of nice if you go into the stores and the prices have stayed the same, or they've gone down maybe 0.5% or 1% from a year ago or 2 years ago. You know, you're feeling pretty good about that. But it can hurt an economy as well. For instance, 1929 and 1933, the Consumer Price Index, it fell 35%. Now, just as we talked about the winners and the losers with inflation, and we said, well, if there's a lot of inflation, people who borrowed a lot of money are the winners. Well, with deflation, if you borrowed a lot of money, you are not the winner, you are a big loser. And that's what happened, unfortunately, to a lot of farmers and homeowners back then, because they had these big loans or mortgages out. And now, instead of paying the loans back with cheaper dollars, they're paying the loans back with more expensive dollars. And it was crushing these people. You know, many farmers, they lost their farms because these loans that they had taken out, or mortgages, they were just so much more expensive to pay back. Okay, so with deflation, you have the borrowers losing big time because they are paying the banks back with much more expensive dollars. The dollar is not depreciating, it is appreciating. and quite honestly, governments would be afraid of some large deflation, because what happened in the Great Depression, people started holding on to, well, to the few dollars that they had. They weren't spending, they were holding on to the last minute to spend that money, and it just makes sense because the money was appreciating. It was becoming more and more valuable. And again, not the poor folks didn't have much money to begin with, but the money that they did have, they were hanging on to for dear life, and they were waiting to the absolute last minute to make that purchase. So when we combine that all together, we have aggregate demand, which we'll be talking about in the next week or so. Aggregate demand went down, and that just made everything just so much worse. Okay, so deflation can be a problem. All right, so and again we say being rich isn't so much about how much money you have. It's really more towards your purchasing power, and that's very true. Again, goes back to the big problem with inflation is the purchasing power. Okay. All right. So we're gonna end this video and start up another one